Friday on Glenn Beck's show on the Federal Reserve. Did anybody, by show of hands, anybody happen to catch that? Good. All right. So we're going to be going a little bit more in depth tonight into the foundations of the Federal Reserve and talk about the people behind it and exactly what it is, define some terms, and go from there. But first of all, let me introduce the subject by talking about one of my favorites from college as I read this fellow's work. Sun Tzu was a Chinese master military general. And he wrote this book called The Art of War. It has been adapted for business, for sports, for politics, for a whole bunch of different things. And there's some real gems of wisdom that Sun Tzu shares with us. First he says, if you know neither yourself nor the enemy, you're bound to lose every time you go to war. And understand, when we talk about politics, guys, and you probably know this by now, this is a blood sport. We're not talking about these liberal leftists. They're not going to make nice with you or anything like that. We're talking about war. We're talking about a blood sport. That's what it's about. So we are talking about war. It says, if you know yourself but not the enemy, you got maybe a 50-50 proposition when you engage in battle. So the critical point is that if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you're going to win every battle. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is knowing what things are supposed to be and what the enemy is trying to do to our monetary system. And then lastly, all warfare is based in deception. So you're not going to get people saying, hey, by the way, over here, I'm trying to destroy the middle class. Of course, we know that's what they're doing, but they're not going to be so kind as to let us know. So let me give you the topics of discussion tonight. We're going to be talking about the rule book for money and banking. Believe it or not, there is an actual rule book on this stuff. We're going to understand some basic terms. We're going to take a look at history of money in America. And I've got this binder here as well that you can come up and see that's got some of the actual notes and you know, what gold coin and silver coins look like. And I've even got a Reichsmark from Germany in here. So we'll go through some of these things. And I'll have some of the things up on the board here as well. We're going to take a look at the Federal Reserve System from the who, what, and why standpoint, so you understand fully what this is and what it's about. And lastly, we're going to talk about some solutions. Because if you just argue about problems and you never talk about solutions, you're looking at a false road. I myself have no intention of being the best educated member of any concentration camp, and I hope you don't have that goal either going forward. So first, let's talk about the rule book. When we talk about the rule book, this is the foundation that made our nation great. This is the foundation that our founding fathers pointed to on a whole host of subjects, and it's simply that. And that rule book is good for money, for banking, for economics, for politics, for law, for morality, for really all sorts of other things that you couldn't even fit on this screen. And it gives us the foundations that we build from. For example, we know in Scripture that the concept of the ends justifies the means is not biblical. Right? That's great for communists, that's great for Mao, that's great for those guys, but it simply doesn't work for us, because if we ignore God's law, we're building on what? We're building on sand, right? Right? It will go nowhere. And if we are going to expect the blessings of God, we have to have our actions and our duty performed in accordance with God's law. So the first thing that we have to understand is that all of these things have to be rooted in the Bible. And to take that one step further, when our founding fathers were contemplating our system of government, one of the things that they went to, first and foremost, in addition to the Bible, was a fellow by the name of Blackstone. He had commentaries on the law, and Blackstone was critical to point out that all of law comes down to biblical morality. And and stems from the Bible. And this is very clear in their mind. So with that, let's start defining some basic terms. First of all, what is money? Well, very simply, it's a commodity that we can use to exchange things. Better than a barter system because you don't have to necessarily know what the other guy wants. So that's the basic term of money. Now money has a couple functions. Medium of exchange, unit of count, store of value. So it can do all of those things. So when we talk about what money should be doing, let's make sure we have an understanding of exactly that. There's 5 key features of money, and I've got them listed up here. It needs to be valuable, divisible, transportable, durable, and scarce. If it meets all of those 5 qualities, then you've got something that's good for money. Now, in history, there's a lot of different things that have been used for money. So we've got a couple examples here on the wall. Seashells, nails, salt, cattle. All of those kinds of things were used as money throughout history, but all of them have had certain deficiencies. However, there has been one idea for money that has really stood the test of time. And when you talk about that, it has come into a few different forms, and I've got those listed up there. Commodity money, fiduciary money, and fiat money. Commodity money is like seashells or salt, or as we're going to talk about in a minute, gold, in that it has some intrinsic value to it, right? Fiduciary money, it's sort of like a coat check. If you go to, you're going out someplace fancy and they've got a coat check office, you give them your coat and they hand you that little tab, right? Now that little tab's not going to keep you warm at night, but it's going to allow you to go back to the coat room and get your coat, and that's going to keep you warm, right? So that's the idea of fiduciary money. And then fiat money is just simply, we're printing it out of thin air and just making it up and hope that you take it, right? So we're going to talk about this.
Like what they're doing right now.
Now, throughout history, gold and precious metals have served us very, very well. And let me give you a great example of that. When Jesus walked the earth, you could have taken a 1-ounce gold coin and gone to a really nice, clothing, purveyor, and that 1 ounce of gold would have bought you a really sharp toga and a sash and some pretty sharp sandals, everything that you would have needed to go to the Roman Senate and do business with a senator. Now, in the 1890s, 1 ounce of gold was roughly the equivalent of what's called a double eagle, or a $20 gold piece. Back in the 1890s, you could have taken that $20 gold piece and gone to a haberdashery, and you would have had yourself everything you need for a really nice suit, shoes, attaché case, everything to be set up to go do business. Now, of course, today, gold's trading for about $1,450, just shy of $1,500. Well, you know what? You could take $1,500 and you could go to Macy's and you can get yourself a really sharp suit, attaché case, socks, shoes, everything you need to go do business. And so that's that value, that holding power of gold. Now, people will nitpick on gold and they'll have all sorts of comments about it. But again, it comes down to what works in real life as opposed to what should work in textbooks. There's this idea of controlled economy and the Federal Reserve and central banking. I got to tell you what, these guys that go to Harvard and Yale, they can get up here and they can talk to you for an hour and make it sound like a really wonderful idea. But in practice, it doesn't hold water. Just the same way that socialism, you get a real educated socialist teacher, and he can go up here and man, he can tell you a great story about how well socialism should work. But you know what? History has shown us otherwise. So let's talk about one of the drawbacks of going off the gold standard. And one of the key things that a lot of people don't understand is what is inflation. Some people will say inflation is rising prices. You probably heard that from some folks, right? I can assure you that inflation is not rising prices, just the same way that wet pavement does not cause rain. Rising prices are a result of inflation. And so we have to understand that corollary. Now, see, this is very interesting because a lot of times when people are thinking about inflation, it's because they're at the supermarket and bread and milk and all this stuff is going up, or they're at the gas pump and they're paying outrageous sums of money for gas. And so your natural inclination is to get mad at the gas people or get mad at the grocery stores. You know, I saw something go around on the internet one day that we need to boycott gas stations for a day to teach them a lesson. Right? Well, see, they're not the ones driving the prices. It's driven somewhere else. And we're going to talk about that. Because inflation, its very definition, is the increased volume of money going around. It's like a basketball. You have it deflated, and then you blow it up, it's got more air molecules, right? That's what inflation is all about. More dollars chasing the same goods. That's what inflation is. We have to understand that definition because it's critical, because then we get into fractional reserve banking. Now, this is a very important concept to understand because what the Federal Reserve Bank is doing is not just creating more money, which they're certainly doing, but then they use fractional reserve banking to allow that money to multiply many times over as it goes out. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but you have to understand that this is what really then drives inflationary pressures. But the key thing to understand, and the bottom line on this, is that when we're driving those numbers up by creating money, it's essentially counterfeit money. Right? It's not like the banks were good stewards, they went out and they joined business partners and they made money and now they're loaning that back out. No, no, no. The bankers are just creating it and then pushing it out into the economy. And that's what they're doing. And that's why I call it counterfeit. So let's talk about how this is done. Now, some of you might be already familiar with this concept that if you're going to boil a frog, you don't take the frog and throw it in boiling water. No. You have nice, cool water, you stick the frog in there, you turn up the heat slowly, and pretty soon you got boiled frog, right? So the same process has been used with our money. This here is an 1881 silver certificate. And what's noteworthy about this is right on the bill, you will see this thing says, this certifies that there has been deposited in the Treasury of the United States 100 silver dollars, payable to the bearer on demand. And remember that coat check analogy that I used? That's exactly what that was. You could take that and go to, the U.S. bank and turn it in, and they will plunk down 100 silver dollars. Right? That was how that worked. And the same thing with gold. Here's a 1922 gold certificate. It says this certifies that there has been deposited in the Treasury of the United States $100 in gold coin. And the same thing, you could go turn that out. Now, what was important about this is that they could not issue those notes unless they physically had $100 in gold coin or 100 silver dollars in their vault. None of that could go out until they had it on deposit. Now that sounds okay, but it changes. Now, Federal Reserve came around in 1913. This is an example of a 1928 Federal Reserve note. And what they've done here is they say, no, redeemable in gold coin on demand at the United States Treasury, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank, to pay to the bearer on demand. Well, okay, so that doesn't sound too bad, right? I mean, you can still go get it and it's redeemable in gold coin, right? Now, notice it doesn't say there has been deposited that money, right? So there's a key change there. And then it says, or lawful money. Well, what the heck is lawful money? It's gold and silver. I mean, you'd think, and I think most people at the time figured that's exactly what it was. And here's another example of a Federal Reserve note. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury. Now, see here, from 28 to 34, notice what they dropped? The gold. Now it's just lawful money. And it would have been interesting back in 1934 to, take that into the bank and say, I'd like my lawful money, please. Can you imagine what the teller would look at you? It's like, well, you want 520s or 1010s? What are you talking about here, right? What the heck is lawful money? And so they kept the language still the same because it's still redeemable, right? So people are still contemplating, yeah, it's still redeemable, but there have been some key changes. And of course today, well, the gig's up. Because now all that redeemable stuff, totally gone. And now what we have is, this note is legal tender, right? So notice the change here. It went from being a code check to being the code. Right? And that's that slow process which they went through to make that happen. Now let's see some of the results of that, because they've been dramatic. Some of you have been conditioned to think, well, inflation is just part of life, right? That's just part of how it goes. But historically, we know that that's just simply not true. For most of the history of the American Republic, there was virtually no inflation whatsoever, right? So we have here where they're creating the Federal Reserve, right? Then here they're going out off the gold standard. Here they go off the international gold standard, and they're inflating the money like you wouldn't believe. Right? Inflation is not something that's just part of life. Inflation is not something that is just an inevitable part of progress. Inflation is specifically designed and controlled and manipulated, and we see evidence of that very clearly. Now, this idea that they're just printing money, that this just comes out of nowhere, for most Americans, this just seems so hard to get their head around, and you almost want to disbelieve it, like that just couldn't be the case. So what I've got here, and hopefully this will be loud enough, this is a 60 Minutes clip of Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. What he's going to explain to you is that these banks that got the stimulus money and all that kind of stuff, that they have accounts at the Federal Reserve, just like you might have an account at your local bank. And what they did is they just went into the computers and they just started putting more money into their accounts just by inputting the numbers. And that, I guess, they're essentially just printing money. Let's see what Bernanke is about to say.
Money. The banks have accounts with the Fed, much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
You've been printing money.
Well, effectively, and we need to do that.
So here's the problem. They said, well, we need to do that. And of course, here's the results of what they need to do that with. Every economic downturn in the last 80 years, you can track directly back to the boom-bust cycle created by inflation and money. This is how they manipulate and boost the system. And on top of that, what they have done in the process is virtually destroy the value of the dollar. And that has been the goal that they're looking for. And of course, this you can see as evidence of that in terms of the buying power. While everybody's been paying attention to everything else, they've been sucking the value out of your money. And consider this example. Say, Grandpa back in the day had $10,000, an enormous sum of money back in 1913, and he stuck that in a safe, right? And over the course of 80 years, well, maybe somebody came in and just robbed them, right? That'd be theft, and we'd recognize it as theft. But what these guys did is they just started pumping so much more money that's unbacked by anything into the system that it essentially took that $10,000, which used to be worth a lot of money, and made it worth a lot less. I mean, back then you could have bought several houses for $10,000. Today you can't even buy a car for it. And that has been how they have overseen the destruction of the U.S. dollar. So of course this starts begging the question, all right, we know that the United States, for example, is a republic and not a democracy. And hopefully in this room, some of you have, who's read 5,000 Year Lead by Cleon Skousen? Good, so you've got some idea of what we're talking about here. And you know that the government has few and defined powers, right? But they can't just do whatever they want. If it seems like a good idea, they just can't go out and do it. They have to have a specifically granted, enumerated power under the Constitution, or they can't do it. In fact, with Obamacare, that's one of our principal arguments, right? Hey, they don't have authority to do that. They don't have authority to do this either. Well, again, it starts raising some questions. Well, if this is what they're doing, how have they been getting away with it? And how have we strayed so far from this system? And we're talking over a fairly lengthy period of time, so we're not talking about just one administration or one bad president. We're talking about a continual push along these lines, and it is unstopped. Now, I would suggest to you that as you contemplate this question, how did we get so far removed? I would suggest to you that there's really three possible answers. First, evolutionary history. Now, evolutionary history, that's what Karl Marx postulates. Cleon Skousen, we just talked about him with regard to the 5,000-Year Lead. He's got another book that he published called The Naked Communist. Absolutely phenomenal book, and it really takes apart this evolutionary history, completely debunks that. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I'm guessing in this room I don't have a lot of proponents of Marxism in here. Safe to assume? All right. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Well, mistakes happen. Maybe what we've got are a bunch of really good people and they're just too smart for their own good, and so they make a few mistakes here and there, and that's how we got so far removed. Well, I don't know. We're going to come back to that, but that's a possibility, so we'll put it up there. I'm going to propose, however, that the third answer is the most viable answer, and that's purposeful design. That what we have are an international cabal of bankers that have specifically put a design together and carried forward an agenda to take total control of our monetary system. And it's done through the Federal Reserve Bank. But hold on a second. Before we go there, let's take a look at the mistakes happen aspect, because that still remains a possibility. So this fella is James Forrestal. He was the Secretary of Defense. It actually used to be the Secretary of War, but I guess that sounded too scary, so they called it Secretary of Defense. Here's what he has to say. He says, "These men are not incompetent or stupid. They are crafty and brilliant. Consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. If they were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. And consider that for a minute. Right? If it's just mistakes happen, how is it that over a course of many years, through Republican administration and Democratic administrations, it doesn't matter. This system has continued to destroy the American dollar no matter what, regardless of administration that's in there. Right? So we have consistency, and again, I would agree with Mr. Forrestal, that is not a function of stupidity. But we'll go one further and we'll take a look at what these bankers actually have to say for themselves. This fellow here, David Rockefeller, some of you might be familiar with him already. In 2002, he wrote an autobiography, and in his autobiography he says, for more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it. That's the man's own words. I didn't say conspiracy, he did. I didn't say cabal, he did. And at this point, you know, there's a great interview with Charlie Rose. Some of you might be familiar with Charlie Rose on PBS, where they sat down right after he wrote this book. And it's sort of an interesting take on it. Charlie Rose turns to David Rockefeller and he says, why on earth did you write this book? And Rockefeller says, well, you know, at this point we're far enough along in the process that, you know, I wanted to take an opportunity to make sure that my friends and my family knew exactly how important I am. And, you know, I'm the guy that introduced Kissinger to Anwar Sadat, and I'm the guy that did this, and I'm the guy that did that. And I can tell you, as a former prosecutor, one of the key things that is the hallmark of criminal activity is they have great big egos, and they love to jammer and talk. They just love to talk. And that's exactly what this guy is all about. And there have certainly been more, and we can identify them. This fellow right here is Rowan Gaither. He was president of the Ford Foundation. Says we shall use our grant-making powers to so alter life in the United States that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Right? And when you look at the Ford Foundation and similar foundations, the Carnegie Foundation, the Fulbright Fellowships, all of these kinds of things, and you wonder, how is it that universities have turned into this bastion of socialism? If any of you have sent kids off to school and they come back and they're talking about all this garbage, right? This is one of the ways they get this done. This was a statement he made at a congressional hearing to a member of U.S. Congress. This fellow right here, Winston Ward, is the former president of a group called the Council on Foreign Relations. He's here on stage with Hillary Clinton, and that's Richard Gere, the famous actor. There says the Trilateral Commission doesn't secretly run the world. The Council on the Foreign Relations does that. Right? And they jockey back and forth. Now, we're going to have some terms, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. For our purposes, they're essentially interchangeable. They do slightly different things in that the Council on Foreign Relations is an American organization populated with American citizens. Not many of them, mind you, but some, where the Trilateral Commission is much more globalist and takes into account Europeans and Asians, but pushing for the same goal, and for our purposes, they're the same thing. Essentially, you can also think about it from the standpoint that the Council on Foreign Relations are specifically dealing with the Federal Reserve Bank, whereas the Trilateral Commission is dealing more with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and essentially the UN version of the Federal Reserve System. Now we can trace this back a little bit further to give you an understanding of who these people are and what the intellectual genesis of them are. This fellow here is Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Some of you might be familiar with that name. He was given all kinds of awards and wrote lots of books. And you have to understand that a lot of these awards, they hand out to these guys to sort of prop up their image. Some of you might remember that Barack Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize recently. You know, I think that was right after he went to his first college game and got the Heisman Trophy. Right. I mean, there's no merit part of it. This is just a function of propping these guys up. Now, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., his history-wise, he was an officer in the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. He was a co-founder for Americans for Democratic Action, which, if you're familiar with ADA or the SDS, we're talking about radical leftist communist front organizations. That was his, that's where he came from. He was deeply involved in a number of administrations, probably most prominently the Kennedy administration. But in particular, one of the reasons why he really came to the forefront is that he was one of the pioneers of how to successfully manipulate the system. And he said in the Partisan Review, sort of an arcane academic journal in the May-June 1947, he says, socialism should be implemented by piecemeal gradualism. And it's critical that the American people do not know what is happening or who's making it happen. Because if they did, they'd object. They'd revolt. They would have a fit if they knew what was going on. And that was the general game plan then that was established. I'm going to go on and talk about this fellow. Some of you might remember the name Carroll Quigley from the Clinton administration. Carroll Quigley was, when Bill Clinton was won the Democratic National, when he won the right to run on their ticket, he took the stage. He praised Carroll Quigley as being his most influential mentor, and he was really an influential mentor for a whole host of these guys at Georgetown University, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He wrote a number of books. The Tragedy and Hope is a great, big, thick book like this. You might be able to even stop a tank with it if need be. And in this book, he says a couple key things. He says, first of all, there does exist this Anglophile network that I just talked about. And he says, I know about it because I've studied it for 20 years. I've been close to it for a couple of years. They even let me in the doors to inspect their books and their secret papers. And I agree with really a lot of it. The only real chief difference of opinion he has is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. And that's his key focus. Now, he goes on to say, in terms of implementing this process, says what we need is two parties that should be almost identical. And he says, you know, this idea that there's going to be one, you know, congressional party of the right and one congressional party of the left, this is really just for people on the outside that don't know what they're doing. Because what we need are two parties that are essentially identical, so that every couple of years the American people can feel like they're throwing the bums out, and essentially the exact same policies get pushed. And, you know, contemplate that also in terms of things you know to be true. Who here remembers Contract with America? Right? Boy, I'll tell you what, that sounded really good, didn't it? They said we're going to get rid of the Department of Education, we're going to get rid of the Department of Energy, and we're going to rein in these you know, environmentalist nuts, and we're going to really ratchet down spending and all that kind of stuff. Bag of goods, right? So you got sold on a bag of rhetoric, and what we got are two parties doing essentially the exact same thing, although you get the good feeling, right? I mean, and I gotta tell you, even when this November election, you know, you see the results, oh, we got Nancy Pelosi out of there and everybody feels great, right? Well, I guess we're gonna see the debt ceiling still going up. They keep saying we're gonna extend, you know, the budget process and the rest of it. And of course, we know that the House of Representatives controls the purse strings, right? So these guys, even if they, you know, don't control the Senate, they can just refuse to fund the thing, right? How many of you believe that's really going to happen? Begs the question. So what we have are essentially two teams, we'll call them the Rockapubs and the Rockocrats, right? They give you two retail outlets that are pushing the exact same policies, right? So for every Henry Kissinger you have on the Rockapub side, you got Zbigniew Brzezinski on the Democrat side. They don't really care who wins. They're controlling both sides, right? Interestingly enough, Zbig there, in 2008, he was Barack Obama's chief foreign policy advisor through the election. Does anybody remember who he was the chief policy advisor for in 2000? John McCain. Right? Same guys. Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, both members of the Council on Foreign Relations, both financed and backed by the exact same people. Mike Huckabee, in 2008, boy, he sounded great. His chief foreign policy advisor was a guy by the name of Richard Haas, president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Right? That's where these guys are coming from. And it's critical to understand their basis, because if you don't understand who the enemy is, it's just not going to work. Now, to a degree, I'm going to call this sort of an open conspiracy. Because if you do some homework and you track down the money, you can find it, right? The key thing is that you're going to find it on, you know, C-SPAN, or, you know, buried on page 814. You're not going to give it to you as the nightly news leader every time. And let me give you an example of that. You guys remember that guy, right?
Vice President Dick Cheney once served as a director, a relationship that Cheney concealed during his congressional career.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
I don't mention that. And I got to tell you, when you look at the Bush administration, I would postulate to you that Dick Cheney had a whole lot more to do with driving policy than George Bush did. George Bush is the front man, but when you look at the power behind the throne that's driving things, I would suggest to you Dick Cheney was the guy. Now let's take a look at CFR role in policy-making decisions. That you remember is your favorite mouse wearing lady. Here's what Hillary has to say.
Oh, thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have this far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
The Richard that she was talking about, that was Richard Haas, the guy that served for Huckabee. Now, we've had in history a couple of folks come out that were members of the Council on Foreign Relations, that found out exactly what this was about, and they were totally disgusted and revolted by what they saw. This guy is one example, not the only example, but perhaps one of the most glaring examples Chester Ward was Admiral U.S. Marine Corps, actually. He was Commandant of the Marine Corps. Was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for 14 years. When he came out, he exposed exactly what was going on, did a national tour around the country to talk about it. He says, the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and national independence and submergence into an all-powerful one-world government. That's the goal of them. And he goes on to say, once the ruling members of the CFR have decided that the U.S. government should adopt a particular policy, the very substantial research facilities of the CFR are put to work to develop arguments, intellectual and emotional, to support the new policy and to confound, discredit, intellectually and politically, any opposition. Now let me give you a very stark example of it. Fortunately, again, in this room, I probably don't have to take too much risk for my own safety by telling you the concept of man-made global warming is a bunch of garbage. I saw one jaw drop. I think it was sarcasm. Now this is a great example. Now first of all, some of you might remember the first thing that they rolled out with was global cooling. Right? And there's some articles from I think Newsweek and some other sources where they're saying the world's coming, we're getting a new ice age, we've got to have radical new environmental laws. Well, the problem is it kept getting warmer. So they scrapped that and they came up with this concept of global warming. And now, I mean, on CBS and NBC and ABC, man, you're getting inundated with this stuff. It's on the cover of Time and Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and the world is coming to an end if we don't deal with man-made global warming. And moreover, if you disagree with this, well, I mean, you would have been like a Holocaust denier, right? You're just stupid and you don't understand science, right? So that's putting that into place. You can see how that works in a very real sense. Now let me give you an example, sort of a modern example, and then I'm going to give you a correlation in time. Some of you guys remember that guy, right? There's jeers in this room, right? All right. Now 7 months before the Democratic National Convention, what do you think the percentage of registered Democrats were that supported Jimmy Carter, or even knew who the heck the guy was? Right? And we're talking about just 7 months before the convention. I mean, you know, think about it now. These conventions are, what, usually August, late August, early September. So we're talking about, you know, the equivalent of February, March, right? Where the guy's a complete unknown. I mean, think about that today with the way presidential campaigns are running. I mean, people have lots of time. Well, here's the number. 4%. That's it. Nobody hardly knew the guy. So Barry Goldwater, in his autobiography, says, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. They helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers. And all of a sudden, this guy is on CBS and NBC and ABC, right? He was on Time Magazine and Newsweek and the Wall Street Journal, all with these wonderful, glowing, comments about what a great guy he is. From nowhere to superstar. And think as well about Barack Obama, right? You go back a couple of years and somebody said Barack Obama, they probably think you're talking about Osama bin Laden, right? Well, and today they might be thinking of Osama bin Laden, right? But he gets a nice big cameo in the 2004 election cycle, right? And then all of a sudden, man, this guy is all over the news, CBS, NBC, CNN, all over the place, right? From nowhere to somewhere. Now, let me take you back a little bit further to suggest to you that Woodrow Wilson in 1913, we're talking about the exact same situation. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, in his first run for presidency, 2/3 of his entire campaign was funded by just 7 people. Just 7 people. All of them Wall Street bankers that are tied to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Now, Barry Goldwater goes on, and I think he says some real key things. He's talking about the Trilateral Commission, the CFR is also part of it, and he says, look, this is a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the 4 centers of power. And he's talking about political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical. And he points out that as the managers and creators of the system, they will rule the future. Now, we're going to talk mostly about the control of monetary policy. But just to point out the intellectual, that's the purpose of subverting the universities and using those foundations. And ecclesiastical, also very important, because one of the things that they understood right from the get-go is what they are talking about is absolutely antithetical to Christian belief. Right? And so in order to accomplish this goal, one of the absolute key things that they must do is destroy the Christian faith. Destroy the core tenets of Christian belief. And it is an absolutely necessary element. Let me give you a quick example of that. Some of you might be familiar with a guy by the name of Rick Warren, writes The Purpose-Driven Life, and is one of the media's darlings of the ecclesiastical Christian movement. When you actually read his books, what he is doing is he is very subtly, very skillfully changing the Christian doctrine of faith in Jesus Christ, and faith in God, and an understanding of sin, and turning it instead to sort of a feel-goodery. Right? And that's the key aspect of that. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I do in other presentations, but only to point out that what we are talking about here is not a debate of, an idea and whether it's, a better idea or not such a hot idea. What we are talking about is the very definition of good versus evil, and understanding that there is something called absolute truth, and that the Federal Reserve System and the people behind that reject that and are moving forward to replace God with themselves as controllers. So again, we're not talking about good idea, bad idea. We're talking about good versus evil in very real terms. So, people will say, well, wait a second. I mean, come on. You're saying all this stuff is happening. Well, you know what? I mean, I've been around for a long time. I was born at night, but it wasn't last night. So, son of God, if all this stuff was happening, if there was this true battle between good and evil, well, Walter Cronkite would have told us that, right? I mean, we know about it. Well, here's what Walter Cronkite's got to say.
Today we must develop ethical structures of global government. Deal with rule of law. We need a system that enforces the rule of law. Democratic federal rule of government.
In a close circuit lookup, Hillary Clinton congratulated Cronkite.
For decades, you told us the way it is. But tonight, we honor you for fighting the way it could be.
In 1993, the WFA honored an editor for Time magazine for an essay he had written entitled The Birth of a Political Nation.
All right. So, all right. Now you're saying, Robert, all right, there's this big conspiracy and the media's in on it and everything else. I mean, what's the deal here? Is everybody in on this thing? No, I mean, these are reasonable questions to ask. And besides, why are they doing this? I mean, is this money? Is that what this is all about? Well, I would say there's a couple different levels we have to look at it first. First, our top level operatives. I can guarantee you that David Rockefeller has plenty of money. He doesn't really need another yacht or another jet or another building. He's set. So what is it that he's after? I would suggest to you power. Now, power can mean a lot of different things to different people, and let me put it in the starkest terms of what I'm talking about. Say David Rockefeller came in, and he looked at you and he said, "Sir, I want you to take this knife and slit this guy's throat." Now you're going to think the guy's a kook. You might already think he's a kook. You're going to call the cops are going to show up, they're going to take him off to jail. Now, Rockefeller's a powerful guy, he's got a lot of money, he's probably got a lot of lawyers on retainer, and chances are within a couple hours, somebody's made a call to a friend of theirs that's the judge, and man, he's back on the street, maybe nothing ever comes of it, right? Because he's a powerful guy. Now, let's do this. Let's consider that we're in Red China and Chairman Mao comes in. And he says, "Sir, you're going to take this knife and slit this guy's throat." Now, your only quandary is, whose throat's getting slit tonight, his or mine? But that's power. And it's not just power for today, it's power for a really long time. We're talking about creating dynasties. I can remember when I was in college, I had a great professor who once quipped that capitalism works well because rich people have stupid children. And think about it as well. Folks come up with a great idea, and you know what? Somebody else then comes up with an even better idea. And that marketplace works very well to drive innovation, right? But big companies, they rise and they fall, right? I mean, where was, Microsoft 100 years ago? It was nowhere. Where was Apple 50 years ago? It was nowhere, right? But these guys, they're talking about real power that they're going to pass on for generations. Now, they've got some lower level puppets. These are the mouthpieces. These are the George Bushes and Barack Obamas. And their motivation is just self-aggrandizement, ego, money. Maybe for Bill, he wanted improved dating life. I don't know. But that's what they're about. So what we have here, to be sure, is at the top, few, and at the bottom, many. So when we're talking about what these bankers are doing, so it's politically, monetarily, intellectually, spiritually, at the top, we have very few people, but the folks that are driving the levers are the puppets that work for them. And they're smart guys. I'm not talking, these are not stupid people. This is the varsity team that we're playing against. Right? And go back to what Forrestal was saying. These guys are brilliant. They know exactly what they're doing. And they're doing it very well, very effectively. So let me take you back to the beginnings of the CFR and really the Federal Reserve and introduce you to this gentleman here. Some of you might even remember, I think this book has been featured on Glenn Beck's show. Does anybody remember seeing this or Glenn Beck talking about it? A few of you? Right. That is Edward Daniel House. Now House, they called him Colonel House. He wasn't a colonel, he was sort of like a Kentucky colonel. He didn't actually serve in any military designs. But this book, Philip Drew Administrators, really one of the crucial things that we can look at for the blueprint that he wrote. Now, Philip Drew was not like a historical book, it was a work of fiction, and it was essentially him laying out the blueprint for the 20th century. and how we're going to push us from where we are to what he was hoping to achieve, and he makes it very clear what he was hoping to achieve. His goal, in his own words, to drop the bomb on it, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He made it very clear that that's what he was looking for. But he said to achieve that, we need to do a couple things. We need an income tax, we need a national bank, Federal Reserve, we need a social security system, we need to restructure the U.S. Constitution, we need an imperial presidency, and establishment of world government. Now, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the national bank. One thing that I do want to mention on the structure of the U.S. Constitution, tomorrow night there was a notice that Tom Rice is going to be talking about in Article 5 Constitutional Convention. That's the push to restructure the U.S. Constitution. And it's got their fingerprints all over it, and we recommend that. Let's talk about ownership of the Fed. A lot of times people will say the Federal Reserve, well, that's got to be part of the federal government, right? I would submit to you that the Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank. In fact, you can see in court cases, somebody once tried to sue an employee of the Federal Reserve Bank under 1983 statute, and the court dismissed it, and they said, I don't think you understand, this guy's not a federal employee. He's a private bank employee. And in fact, the Federal Reserve is not owned by the federal government. It is owned by member banks, and the member banks then have shares of it. Now, this is an unusual sort of beast because it's true that you can't go to the New York Stock Exchange and buy shares of the Federal Reserve. But Chase Manhattan Bank, right, they're certainly publicly traded. They're one of the owners of it. Now, I will guarantee to you, you will not be able to buy a controlling share of Chase Manhattan Bank. Right? But those are the guys that own it. Now, also they're the guys that got the stimulus money. Remember that? Oh, yes. Now let me talk about the creators of the Federal Reserve. So on Friday, there was this discussion of The Creature from Jekyll Island, a book written by G. Edward Griffin. And it's really probably the finest, most well-documented. There's a reason why Glenn Beck highlighted it, because if you want to look at how the Federal Reserve was formulated, there's just no better book than The Creature from Jekyll Island. Now, Jekyll Island refers to a meeting at a place called Jekyll Island. It was sort of a retreat for the uber rich, and it was attended by 7 guys. And here are these 7 right here. Collectively, they represented fully 25% of the entire wealth of the world in those 7 guys at this meeting. And of course, if it had gotten out that the bankers were coming together to formulate a plan for a regional or for a national bank, well, the thing never would have gone anywhere, because it's the bankers putting things together to put the screws to the American people. So they decided that what they would have to do is do this whole trip incognito, not let people know exactly what was going on. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, this guy here, Nelson Aldrich, was a member of the U.S. Senate. When he proposed a similar plan, it got shot down because his connections were so tight with the bankers. So when they came in, they reintroduced it, they tweaked it a little bit, and his name was nowhere on it. And that's how they pushed this through in 1913. Now, these guys have talked about it after the fact. Frank Vanderlip said there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that has been fixed on last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. else our efforts would be wasted. So they understood secrecy was absolutely critical. Nelson Aldrich, in his official biography, talks also about this trip and how they got on this train and they were, dressed up like they were going to a duck hunt, right? And he sort of talks about how one of them, Paul Volcker, right, thought this was all very funny because he had never been hunting in his life, didn't even own a gun. Lastly, in The Independent, a periodical in July 1914, he makes it very clear that the idea here was that we wanted to go beyond just being able to dominate banking institutions at Wall Street, but they wanted to dominate banking nationwide. And that was the function of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, there were some early warnings. Charles Lindbergh, famous congressman, he was sort of the Michelle Bachmann of his day. And he said at the time, this Federal Reserve Act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When Woodrow Wilson signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of ages was perpetrated by this banking and currency. We understood exactly what was at stake here. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations was instituted. We talked about Edward Mandell House. He was one of the founding members. He actually started this in 1921. Some of you might remember, after the close of World War I, there was something called the League of Nations. That was the precursor to the United Nations. You guys remember what happened to it? Failed, right? Everybody joined it except the United States. And so it died right on the vine. So what they said was, all right, you know what? Here it is. We let a good opportunity, a good crisis go to waste. Man, and they hate it. Right? So they started the Council on Foreign Relations, and in England, there was the Royal Institute on International Affairs, a sister organization, and the specific purpose of this was to try to, again, recapitulate and reform world government, that other aspect that Edward Mandell House was going for. And I bring this to your attention because what the goal here is to so completely destroy the U.S. dollar with the Federal Reserve Bank that you will have no choice but to welcome with open arms an international world currency. They've got it planned out. That's the function and the purpose of the United Nations. Now, if 10 years ago somebody said, hey, we're going to get rid of the dollar, we're going to have a world currency, oh, there's no way the American people would take that. It just wouldn't happen. We're too patriotic. But now, if you have a system where the dollar is on the verge of collapse, and they're telling you that your 401k portfolios are going straight into the toilet, and you have no choice but to take this or else you're going to be completely wiped out, now you might be a little bit more welcome to the concept. Because they're not going to let a good crisis go to waste again. That's the end goal. Now let me wrap up. Unfortunately, with time constraints, we can't go too far. So let me give you a couple ideas for reading materials. Some of these are sort of short books, and by the end of the summer, you could plow through all of this stuff and have a real clear understanding of what's going on. So with understanding the Council on Foreign Relations, I think there's no better book out there than The Shadows of Power. It is wonderfully well documented, and you can source the material, and the footnotes I think are critical. The Blue Book of the John Birch Society was written by Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. That is a transcript of the inaugural conference when he built the society in 1958. And when you read the book, I mean, you'll be thinking that the guy who wrote it like a week ago, because it is so clear, so concise with exactly what will happen with our country. It's just shocking that this was written in the late 50s. None Dare Call It Conspiracy. Some of you might already be familiar with that book because it sold millions and it very clearly laid things out. Cleon Skousen, author of The 5,000-Year Leap, I made reference to The Naked Communist. In this book, The Naked Capitalist, he sort of takes on this question. He says, you know what, when people look at these billionaires, and here it is, they're pushing socialism, in a sense, this doesn't make sense. You would think capitalists that got rich on capitalism would love capitalism. So he takes this issue, and in particular, he addresses the Federal Reserve Bank and exactly what we just talked about tonight, and lays it out clearly with a lot of the same photos, actually, that I used here tonight. And Skousen's just a brilliant guy. I mean, his research was impeccable. He was also a senior agent in the FBI, so he had a real clear idea, a front row seat on exactly what was going on. United Nations Exposed by Bill Jasper, again, is one of the best scholarly works at what the United Nation is, who's behind it, why they're driving it, and again, has source material so you can see it. And then The Preacher from Jekyll Island, that's a pretty thick book, but absolutely essential reading on this topic so that you'll understand exactly what's going on. Now, some people will say, oh, geez, you know what? If you really get into this Jekyll Island stuff, and you're talking about these international bankers, and you believe that the media is slanted and has an agenda, well, you obviously must be some raving lunatic. You'll never win elected office anywhere. You're probably anti-Semitic. You're probably racist. Some of you have heard some of that, right? Well, so I bring up this slide. Butch Otter is the current sitting governor of